The towering figure in the crisp red tunic and bearskin hat stood motionless, his face expressionless, his eyes fixed on a distant point. Tourists giggled and snapped pictures, some waving hands in front of his face, others whispering bets on who could make him flinch. To them, he was just another royal guard, a human statue. But behind those stoic eyes lay a storm no one could see. No one knew the torment that gnawed at his soul, the secret pain he bore with every breath. His name was Thomas Whitaker, and he had spent years perfecting the art of being invisible while standing in plain sight. But inside, he was drowning. Thomas had always dreamed of serving the crown. As a boy, he idolized the guards, imagining himself in their polished boots, protecting history itself. But dreams rarely align with reality. 3 years into his service, his personal life was unraveling. His mother's battle with cancer was nearing its tragic end. His younger sister depended on him for stability, and the financial burden had drained every ounce of his energy. Yet, none of that could show on his face. A royal guard does not cry. A royal guard does not falter. A royal guard does not break character. Every day he stood for hours, enduring physical exhaustion and mental torment. The taunts from tourists were nothing compared to the voices in his head, whispers of self-doubt, fear, and exhaustion. You are failing. You cannot protect the ones you love. But he had no choice. His job was to be unshakable, an unwavering symbol of duty and tradition. So he stood, rigid and silent, even as his world crumbled beneath him. One bitterly cold morning, Thomas was stationed outside Buckingham Palace. The sky was gray, mirroring the weight in his chest. Then it happened. A small boy, no older than 7, broke free from his mother's grasp and ran up to him. The crowd gasped. Tourists waited, phones poised, anticipating the boy's inevitable removal by security. But instead, the boy simply stood there, staring up at him with wide, innocent eyes. "You look sad," the boy said softly. Thomas remained still, but inside, something cracked. No one had noticed before. No one had ever looked past the uniform, past the rigid discipline, past the mask. The boy's mother rushed forward, apologizing, trying to pull him away. But before he left, the boy reached into his pocket and pressed something into Thomas's gloved hand. A small, folded note. For the first time in his career, Thomas allowed himself a small movement. He tightened his fingers around the paper. It was barely noticeable, but for him, it was monumental. That evening, after his shift, Thomas retreated to his small apartment, exhaustion settling into his bones. He carefully unfolded the note. It read, "Even the strongest knights need to rest. It's okay to be human." His vision blurred. He pressed the paper to his chest, allowing himself to feel, to acknowledge the weight he had carried alone for so long. The words of a child had broken through years of silence. For the first time in months, he made a decision. He reached for his phone and called his sister. He told her everything: the struggle, the pain, the fear. Instead of disappointment, he was met with understanding. "You don't have to do this alone, Thomas," she said. That night, he allowed himself to weep, and in those tears, he found a strange kind of strength. The next morning, Thomas reported for duty, but something had changed. He stood just as tall, just as disciplined, but now he carried a newfound sense of purpose. He was not just a guard. He was a man, a brother, a son, and he was allowed to feel. He started opening up to his fellow guards, subtly checking in on them, making sure no one else was carrying the same silent burden. Slowly, a bond formed among them, an unspoken understanding that behind the rigid uniforms, they were human. One day, a young recruit struggling to adjust to the grueling discipline came to him for advice. Instead of brushing him off with stoic indifference, Thomas did something different. He placed a reassuring hand on the recruit's shoulder and said, "Even the strongest knights need to rest. The words of a child passed on. Months later, while on duty, a familiar face appeared in the crowd, a little boy holding his mother's hand. He smiled up at Thomas, eyes filled with recognition. Thomas, still bound by duty, couldn't respond. But as the boy turned to leave, he did something no one expected. In the slightest of movements, he nodded. The boy beamed, squeezing his mother's hand. And for the first time, Thomas realized strength wasn't about standing still. Sometimes the bravest thing one could do was allow themselves to be seen. He was a royal guard, but he was also human, and that made all the difference.